Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world, because we know there's quite a few people logging on internationally to the second in our infrastructure intelligence coming out of COVID webinar series. Today's event is on the extreme and one that I think it's fair to say that a lot of people are talking about, not just in our industry, the role of infrastructure investment in kickstarting the economy. And our panel assembled here in the UK this morning is drawn from a number of different organisations that are active within our industry. We've got representation from the Civil Engineering Contractors Association, the public. I'm not sure what's happening there. Hopefully that'll go off. It has gone off. Apologies for that. We've also got representation from the public sector procurement organisation Scape Group. We've got Ipsos Mori joining us to offer some perspectives on public opinion on this issue. We've got someone from Barton Wilmore, and we've also got someone from EY. And I'm sure that in a week, when the Construction Leadership Council launched its recovery plan for the industry, we'll have quite a lot to talk about. Anyway, without further ado, I'd just like to introduce our first speaker in the webinar today, and that's Saya Ganbari. Saya is a partner for the infrastructure advisory at EY and is obviously well clued in on all matters infrastructure. So Saya, over to you.
Thank you, Andy. Hello, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. I'm delighted to be here. Before jumping into some of my views on sort of the plans on infrastructure investment, I wanted to start with a bit on the economic context. So in the last few years, the discussions on the UK economy have been almost entirely dominated by Brexit, its implications and the various predictions on those connections, but the underlying performance of the economy actually saw relatively little change. And you then fast forward to sort of March 23rd, 2020, when the UK government imposed a lockdown and significant amounts of economic activity essentially hit a pause button. And so what does that sort of mean in terms of the economic indicators? Now, I think the word is uncertain. And the consequences that most businesses are now having to look at multiple scenarios. And I'm sure for those who are interested in this topic, you would have seen that scenarios that are describing the length of slowdown and the pace of recovery sort of come in the shape of letters of the alphabet. We've talked about V-shaped or U-shaped, W-shaped, or even L-shaped is what's dominating the discussions. And so that makes forecasting quite tricky, but if I can share a few numbers. So the EY Item Club spring forecast, which was released end of April, is expecting the UK GDP to contract by 6.8% in 2020, with recovery unlikely to come until 2021. That is in contrast to the winter forecast that was only released in January this year, which projected actually growth, a small amount of growth, but 1.2% growth for the UK economy this year. So you can see kind of how much has changed in very little time. And it's worth just adding that that spring forecast was based on lockdown restrictions easing in May and more so in June, which we're now starting to see, but albeit on a sort of slow trajectory and with continued uncertainty around the potential of a second peak and those implications. So why does infrastructure matter in all of this? I think it's important for us to recognize that infrastructure investment was already a key policy component for this government to take us out of a relatively flat or slow kind of economy to higher growth rates. And I think what we've seen with COVID-19 is the government's willingness to provide support for businesses and employees in a series of initiatives to protect the economy. But the longer and deeper the hit to the economy, the greater the role that the government will need to play in the future. And I think this is where the government will shift effort towards stimulus programs that don't just provide support, but also promote growth. And this is really where infrastructure investment will come in. And in that sense, I don't see anything changing from this government's view that spending on public infrastructure is a tool for beating a recession. And I think this will actually just be seen, if anything, as a more attractive type of stimulus than some of the support measures that have been in place to deal with the pandemic. But there are challenges, and my personal opinion is that not all spend is equal, and that it's not just that any money spent will help us out of the immediate recession. So if I give you some examples, infrastructure investment has long development times, and the development times in the UK are getting longer, not shorter. So even when there is capital to spend, finding sort of shovel-ready projects is hard. Approvals can take 5-10 years and costing significant amounts of money without necessarily generating any new assets in that time. The contrast to that is sort of when you are rushing with a lot of capital and trying to find shovel-ready projects is finding the balance on investing in the right things as opposed to just investing in anything. Delivery timelines are also, we have seen, have been challenging on some of the major programs. So we've seen delays to Crossrail and similarly for HS2 in terms of delivery timelines against initial proposals. I think we've seen that HS2 got its green light to enter the construction phase for the southern part of the route after years of development, but the northern route still not through the sort of hybrid build stages, and that only emphasises the point I've just made in relation to development. And I also think, with sort of multiple competing public infrastructure projects, we will hit a skills gap. The sector is struggling for talent, and it will become saturated. We have the risk of running out of skills before we run out of capital in this sense. So what does that mean, and what would I do if I were Minister for Infrastructure, if I'm applying for that job, if ever it comes up? So here are some things that I guess I would prioritize and think about. So I'm just going to go through a list of 5 things, bear with me, but the first one would be regional development. So the levelling up agenda has to be followed up with policy and action. If I use foreign direct investment as an example proxy, so despite Brexit uncertainty in 2019, despite Brexit uncertainty, 2019 was a good year for UK overseas investment, but the reality is that the standout success was London. And we know that foreign investors sort of favour skilled local talent and excellent transport infrastructure as some of the criteria that they use. And so there's a real opportunity to use our domestic investment to address the structural imbalance between London and the southeast and the rest of Great Britain. So it has to be, regional development has to be priority. My number 2 is about governance, and I think we've seen, the examples of the Nightingale hospitals have shown what can be achieved in short order when needed. And I think there is an urgent need to re-look at the governance that slows development and delivery timelines. And there needs to be a recognition that of the cost of extensive reviews, that not just sort of financially, but also the delays resulting in reduced economic impact, particularly when a lot of the reviews are not necessarily leading to fundamentally different decisions being taken. So I think better governance will lead to better investments and avoiding sort of a rush to shovel-ready projects to generate economic stimulus, but focusing on investment in both what's ready and what's right, and balancing that short and long-term view. My third point is about technology. I think investment in technology to improve existing assets so that you can get more out of them rather than building new is quicker and arguably therefore of greater value when looking to infrastructure as a stimulus measures. So the improvements that technology can provide to productivity of existing assets, so I'll use digital signalling on the railway networks as an example, is absolutely significant. the challenge is there's no ribbon to cut, there's no building to name. But for me, this is a sort of investment that we must consider to have both high priority and have high profile. My fourth point is around investment in skills. So I mentioned the skills gap earlier. And I think this is about addressing this is about making the industry more attractive to a broad range of people. It's no secret that the industry is predominantly white, is predominantly male. And I believe if it doesn't attract and retain a more diverse group of people who see this as a place to make their career, as an exciting place to make a difference, then we will not have the collective ability to deliver on this investment. And I say this because I also fundamentally, personally believe that what makes what makes projects deliver on time, quality, and schedule is people. It's really, there's no more magic to it than that. And we know that diverse organizations are better problem solvers, they're better at raising issues, they're better at addressing them. So if we invest in tomorrow's leaders in the infrastructure and construction sector, we can get better outcomes for us all. And then I want to end on what would be my fifth point, and this by no means is the last point on my list. If anything, it probably is the most important thing. And this is that for me, the stimulus program has to be a green stimulus program. I think if there's anything that this pandemic has taught us, is that we can live it differently. And this is the opportunity for us to accelerate delivery against our net zero commitments and think to the future now. But change does not come without concerted effort. I don't think that we can rest on our laurels here. And our net zero commitments do mean quite fundamental changes to energy sector, to transport sectors. It means using our assets better, as I've spoken about earlier. It also means building greener cities, investing in active transport. These are changes that we have to make today. So I think if we can have one thing to thank the pandemic for, it should be that this was a time when we started to take the climate emergency seriously and built the infrastructure for a better world. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Saya, and I think really interesting finishing on that point about green investment, which is one that keeps coming up over and over again within the industry at the present time. It'll be interesting to see whether or not the good words are actually turned into actual, real actions, really, in the discussion. Our next speaker is Chris Clark, who is Director of Performance and Improvement at the Public Sector Procurement Organization SCAPE Group, which is a public sector partnership which offers many frameworks to the sector and other property and construction related services. So Chris, over.
Thank you, Andy. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. Had some audio problems initially. I'm getting a nod from Andy. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, and it's lovely to be here. Lots of people on the line, so it's lovely to speak to lots of people. Yes, and Andy did a nice little introduction to SCAPE for you there. We offer a public sector procurement. We offer framework contracts which enable clients to get at delivery quickly, and I think that's one of the messages I'll come back to in a moment. I think we're not necessarily as well known as perhaps our reach is, and we are facilitating and have facilitated in the last 3 years £3 billion worth of infrastructure investment by the public sector across mostly across local government, but also the Highways Agency, HS2, and a number of other big clients. So we're a big part of the procurement landscape, and we are absolutely on board with a number of the things Silas just said. I think my starting place is to say we're part of Build UK, and the guidance that the Construction Leadership Council has published in the last few days is absolutely critical. Collaboration is one of our favourite words at SCAPE, but never has that been more important. And I think we have seen in the last few weeks and months perhaps the greatest example of leadership in our industry that there's ever been. I think the way that the collective effort has been given to talking about health and safety during the crisis, during COVID-19, the way our industry has responded to emergency construction of hospitals has been extraordinary, and frankly is a hell of a kickstart to what we need to do next. I'm a real optimist, and I think we've learned a lot in this period of time. So I hope we can, as I said, take the context, take the opportunity, take the learning, and move forward. One of the things that we are very passionate about at Scape is ensuring that clients are able to deliver what they want to deliver without pain and without complexity, with as little risk as possible. And I think one of the things we've got to consider in the coming weeks is making sure that that first part of that recovery program, restart into reset, which is the first kind of 6 months of what the Construction Leadership Council have talked about, that we're pressing the green light button on as many projects as we possibly can, and we're doing it as quickly as we can. And I think the procurement landscape is a very interesting one right now. One of the things that one of the ever discussed principles of EU procurement is how long it takes. And as a country, we've been, I won't say enslaved by procedure. Actually, we wrote most of the rules that are in the EU procurement regulations, and there are good reasons for that. SME engagement, local engagement, making sure everyone gets a fair go at tenders. And we pushed that, wasn't the EU. And actually all of those principles still apply. But what we've also seen during this crisis is the ability to get projects onto site incredibly quickly. And I think there's a desperate need to make sure that anybody with investment money to spend realises they need to start their projects, not start their procurement. And that's something that at Scape we have answers for, but there are many other public sector frameworks out there. And you don't have to abandon the principles of good procurement to get your project started quickly. So I think a big message, a big promotional message from us is that there are lots of experts out there who are out there to help you get your projects onto site quickly. There are businesses that are right on the cusp of falling over at the moment, from the big business through to the tiny business. Furlough scheme's been phenomenally successful in delaying the inevitable, but the inevitable will come. Businesses will fail in the next few months. The reason they'll fail is cash flow. And if you don't think procurement is a major problem, think again, because the cash flow for those projects in many cases was relied upon before those contracts had even been awarded. In many of these businesses, business planning, the speculative aspect of the construction industry is enormous. So we really do need to get through that red tape, get through the procurement landscape as fast as we can on the projects we're trying to restart and get on with. We want to be part of that solution, but I think everybody needs to remember that that's important. So my first point was, for the public sector particularly, don't let the procurement process be a barrier. It doesn't need to be, and there are lots of good people out there to help you with that. And the second point, though, is we need to remember that Simon's talked about it being a green investment and leaving a legacy and doing the things that the environment needs, and that is very high on my list as well. But I think it's also important to think sustainability as we spend our money. Google the UN Sustainable Development Goals if you want, but the basic principles are the economic sustainability of what we do, the environmental, but also the social sustainability. So why that's important for our industry is that about 1 in 10 people are directly employed in UK construction infrastructure. Closer to 20% of the country are directly affected by infrastructure spend in their daily lives. So when we talk about consider how we deal with the social impacts of this investment, what I really mean is consider how we're going to get that investment in the hands of the people who need to spend the money locally. Get the money in the hands of the people who will invest that money in local jobs, in local skills, in local education, in service businesses in your local area. Because that's what happens to the money. It doesn't stop when you build a bridge. That money goes into circulation in the economy around that bridge. It goes into circulation to maintain that bridge. And we need to be thinking about making every pound we spend on infrastructure work as hard as we can. So for me, there are a couple of core principles for any clients listening that we really, really need to consider, and we need to consider before we do anything else. First thing is make sure you're thinking about how hard you're going to make your pound work when you spend it. What's the second cycle of use of that pound after you've committed it to your main contractor? Where are the subcontractors' money coming from and how quickly? So my first point is make sure your contracts are going to deliver high-speed payment through to the supply chain. And if you can't deliver on the fair payment guarantees, find someone who can. Scape's done 100% within the fair payment guarantees in the NEC for the last 5 years on every project we've delivered. It can be done. Get on with it. That's the first point. Get your suppliers paid and get them supplied through the supply chain. And that starts with you as clients. So when your main contractor gives you a stage payment invoice for a part construction, if it's done or if it's nearly done, pay it. Don't wait 2 weeks. Don't let your finance department defer it. Get it paid, because every minute of every day of that money's delayed, it's not getting to your community's hands. So that's a massive thing. So make sure you've got fair payment in your contracts. Make sure fair payment is happening, and that starts with you, goes all the way through to your tier 3, tier 4 subcontractors. The second thing is to make sure that your expenditure is linked in with as much social value as you can generate as possible. At Scape, we've just delivered a work experience program. We had 300 schools take part in 2 weeks ago. We did that because we have the ability to do it, because we have the reach to meet industry and bring industry and education together. But it's just one example of the kind of things you can do with your money if you're smart. And it helps bridge the skills gap, helps bring people into the industry, helps maintain jobs. So, of course, social value also extends into a raft of other areas. So, again, going back to procurement, these are things that are hard to do the first time you do them. So my message is, find these routes that you want, find people who can do them for you. Don't spend a lifetime rethinking how you're going to procure your project. And I think the third thing is to make sure that we're trusting the right people with the risk on these projects, and making sure the right people are managing the risk so that the projects get done. I think there's a real fallacy that there's a small number of people in the construction industry who make the buying decisions. It's actually quite democratic. Once a client decides to give the money to somebody else, they're making most of the buying decisions for you. So let's make sure that we're mature about this. Let's make sure that the organisations that are set up to manage risk, main contractors, principal consultants, project management organisations, that those organisations are there, their contracts are set up right, but that they're being given the risk that they're set up to manage, and that clients are making decisions about funding the right amount of money at the start. And if there's one thing to learn from HS2, is that setting budgets is probably the most important thing you can do, and do it right. Factor in risk, plan for some risk right now, plan to get your money through the system. Especially when we're talking about small scale projects with 0.5% variance, it's more important in terms of the value of that money to get it out there and into the system than it is to worry about 0.25% on the price of bricks. Because frankly, there's going to be an awful lot of supply chain materials and skills that will all be really struggling to contain the price of over the next few months. My final point, and again, it's related to procurement, is don't see competitive tendering with hundreds of bidders as the answer to cheap prices at the moment. There is a huge risk that buyers at all levels consider that this is a great time to go to the market and get competitive pricing. This is the worst possible time to ask main contractors and subcontractors to bid on a 1 in 15 chance to win work. Find ways to engage existing supply chains, whether that's frameworks, whether that's partnership contracts. Find ways to lock in suppliers who are already locked in and get on with it. The value for money piece in collaborative contracts takes care of itself. So use the right contract forms, but the bottom line is let's not spend 2 years putting the industry through a competitive exercise which will put half of it out of business. Let's get on with it. I think that's my headlines. If you haven't read the Construction Leadership Council's plan, Google it, look it up. I will be posting and sharing some case studies that have happened through Scape's frameworks in recent times to demonstrate what's the art of the possible. Don't apologise for thinking quickly and for wanting to move things forward, but as Shane said, we need to make sure that we are spending the money on the right things. So as clients, think about what you want to spend your money on, pick the right things, but then let the industry and those who know how to do it get on with the things they can do really well. And don't try and make those decisions yourself. Try and find partners and friends who can help you with it. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Chris. Some really strong messages there, particularly around risk, payment, fee bidding, and social value as well, which I think is really, really important actually when we talk about how do we persuade not just opinion formers and government, but also the population as a whole. And we'll be hearing more a little bit about their views on issues shortly. Just a quick word on questions. We're getting questions coming in already, which is great. If you can, if it's possible, just put at the beginning of the question where you're from, because that doesn't come up on the question tab for me as the chair. So if you can do that, it just helps, and we're going to give you a name check as well if you want to do that. You don't have to. It's not compulsory. Right. Our next speaker is Ben Lewis, who is the Infrastructure and Energy Director at Barton Wilmore. And Barton Wilmore, for those that don't know, are one of the UK's leading independent planning and design consultancies with a nationwide spread. And I always find that when I look at Barton Wilmore, they seem to me to be a thinking organisation. They've got something to say, and they're always keen to share those views with the industry. So I'm delighted to welcome Ben Lewis here with us today. And Ben, the floor is yours.
Right, can you hear me okay now? I've just had a nice American lady tell me I'm unmuted. Yeah, thanks again for joining this morning. I mean, I think my points I wanted to raise this morning really pick up from the last point that Saya made on the stimulus going forward needs to be green. Now, I mean, my background is in energy consenting, so needless to say, I'm quite interested in the green energy side of the economic recovery. Now, I think infrastructure's got a critical role in economic growth. To be fair, it always has, but it's also got a critical role in tackling the climate change emergency, and we can't separate the two. Now, infrastructure is normally defined as fundamental services, facilities and systems that serve a country, a city or an organisation necessary for the economy and society to work effectively. Now, on that basis, effective infrastructure is essential for economic growth, quality of life and tackling climate change. And these are issues that go throughout the points I wanted to raise this morning. Now, the importance of infrastructure to the UK was highlighted in the first ever National Infrastructure Assessment back in July 2018. The assessment set out a plan of action for the UK's infrastructure for a 30-year timeframe. It took a long-term cross-sector approach and made a series of recommendations, all costed in line with government's guidelines for investment. But the assessment wasn't just about economic growth, it was also about quality of life and meeting net zero. Now, it called for decisive action, long-term vision, lasting plans and stable funding. Unfortunately, we're still waiting for the government's response and the associated national infrastructure strategy. And also expected this year and related to this is the energy white paper, which again is something that's overdue. Now, it's worth remembering and thinking back to the financial crisis of 2008, where infrastructure was used then to get the economy moving. There was some attempts to green the economy at that time, with low carbon and environmental measures, I think accounted for around 16% of the global stimulus spending post 2008. But what's different this time is recoveries coming in the context of climate change emergencies declared by both national government, local authorities, devolved administrations, and a groundswell of public opinion that action needs to be taken. We've had a letter recently submitted to the government by, I think it was around 200 businesses in the UK, asking for recovery to be aligned with the UK's legislated target of net zero by 2050. And earlier this year, the CEO of BlackRock said it was going to sell off shares in coal firms and other major pollutants and called for a fundamental reshaping of finance to tackle climate change. Now, the role of renewable energy development in the transition to net zero has received a considerable amount of coverage, but it's only more recently you will have all noticed, I suppose, that the role of those technologies in economic recovery has come more and more to the fore. So I wanted to think about whether this is justified or not. This year, we've seen renewable energy records being smashed left, right and centre. We've gone over 54 days without coal-fired generation, which is the longest period since the 1880s. We've seen the highest ever wind generating rates, 17 gigawatt in a day in January, highest ever rates for solar, 9.6 gigawatt in a day in April. And on May the 24th, we achieved the UK's lowest levels ever of carbon intensity at 46 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Now, all of this is happening at the same time the cost of renewable energy is becoming lower than ever. Now, I will admit that some of the records are due to the COVID-19 lockdown and the sunniest May on record, but there's no disputing the fact, and it's something that Saya picked up, that the current situation has demonstrated what we can achieve through a combination of changing behaviour and demand, and we should not forget this when we recover from the pandemic. Recent research have been read by the Oxford Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment to actually look back at the 2008 crash and found that putting public money into green projects produced greater returns in both the short and long term than pouring cash into conventional high carbon projects. But net zero is not going to be achieved by any one sector on its own. We'll need change and growth across all aspects of the economy and society. Electricity demand is expected to increase exponentially up to 2050 with the increased electrification of transport and heat. You only have to look at National Grid's future energy scenarios to see that the future decarbonised energy system will be very different to what we have today, with electric vehicles, carbon capture and storage, and hydrogen being integral elements. Now, in terms of CO2 emissions in the UK, transport, power and buildings account for almost 90% of that. So whilst the energy industry's reduced, it has heavily decarbonised to date, there's still work to do. But the level of those emissions shows some of the economic opportunity that it was that exists in tackling those emissions. We can't, however, ignore the harder to decarbonise sectors, so that last 10%, such as agriculture, freight, shipping, aviation, heavy industry. We also need to innovate to meet that challenge. Now, any infrastructure strategy for me needs to be cross-cutting, needs to recognise that you can't do one without the other. And the cross-cutting themes prevalent in the National Infrastructure Commission's work and also in a report published in April by the International Renewable Energy Agency's Global Renewables Outlook. Right, there's a mouthful. The report identified a path to create a sustainable future energy system, highlighted climate-safe investment options and the policy framework that was needed. It set out how energy transition needs to be at the heart of a comprehensive package, which brings together climate goals, economic development and job creation, and social equity and welfare. Now, for me and the UK, part of this comprehensive policy approach will be a national infrastructure strategy, setting out a pathway for the delivery of economic recovery and net zero, recognising all the interrelationships and interdependencies that exist, and providing confidence and certainties to investors that the government's in it for the long term. It needs to look at projects and initiatives that can be delivered in the short term, rollout of 5G, energy efficiency measures for buildings, all of which can deliver economic opportunity and job creation. We also need to look at how we can address the housing crisis in the UK as part of this, and whether new consenting regimes are required to facilitate the delivery of, for example, new settlements. But that's a discussion for a whole other seminar, I think. Now, all of these go hand in hand, and the system of the future also needs to be reliable, secure and affordable, which means that government investment will undoubtedly be required to stimulate deployment, innovation and technological advancement. Now, delivery of the infrastructure the UK needs is dependent on clear supportive policy context, which, as I said, provides greater certainty and a reduced risk profile for investment decisions. This is equally applicable to the renewable and low carbon sectors. As John Armitt recently said, the economy runs on confidence, and the government has a critical role to play in instilling this confidence among investors, businesses and consumers. Now, when it comes to delivering consent for these projects, in the development consent order regime, we have an effective consenting mechanism for nationally significant infrastructure. Systems heavily front-loaded, there's a very high approval rate, and until recent events has provided certainty on the timescales for decision making. It's backed by a suite of national policy statements which establish need for the infrastructure and set out the material considerations for their assessment of their impact. Now, the projects consented through the DCO regime have proved resilient to legal challenge. Only one challenge has succeeded in 12 years of the regime. And the MPSs do provide certainty that investors need. This need, however, is currently under intense scrutiny with legal challenges launched against the airport's MPS and the recently lodged challenge to the energy MPSs. And as I've picked up from one of the questions, now the road investment strategy the government has in place. The issue the government has is a review of an MPS necessitates the extant MPS to be suspended, which obviously removes a layer of policy certainty. So in my view, they need to look at amending the Planning Act to allow an MPS to remain in force until the review is complete, in much the same way as happens for local development plans. Now, we're undoubtedly living in unprecedented times. I have no doubt that infrastructure has a critical role to play, but has to be aligned with a net zero target. We cannot choose between jobs or climate change. We need strategies and policies for both. We need to build back better, focusing on short-term improvements such as 5G rollout, improvements to transport, as well as facilitating established renewable energy types. We also need to focus on things that will be a core part of the net zero transition: hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, and batteries. Also look at routes to market for those technologies. For example, pumped hydro can make a massive contribution to the balance of the electricity system, but there is no current effective route to market for types of these projects with such a high upfront capex. Infrastructure development for me, though, is not the panacea. It's part of a bigger strategic approach that encompasses societal behaviour. We need a whole system approach, sustained political support, and an alignment of economic, social and health goals. Now, I picked up recently a quote by Sir John Armitt in the National Infrastructure Commission's annual monitoring report, and he said the UK desperately needs a strategy that looks well beyond this Parliament, setting out infrastructure policy and funding up to 2050. And I couldn't agree more. And can infrastructure kickstart the economic recovery? Yes, it can. But for me, we need to do more than kickstart the recovery. We need infrastructure to be the backbone of a blueprint for future growth and the transition to net zero, or maybe a green print for future growth. Many thanks.
And now we actually tooled up to actually take the steps forward that we need to take. So I'm sure that some more of that will come up in the discussion. It's been mentioned a number of times already today, and that is the Construction Leadership Council's blueprint for the industry's recovery. And our next speaker is someone who I know, and an organisation who I know has been intimately involved in a lot of that process as the industry has looked to respond to the COVID crisis, but also now crucially to come out of it. And that's Marie-Claude Hemming, who's the Director of External Affairs at the Civil Engineering Contractors Association, SECA. So Marie-Claude, over to you.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak at your webinar. My name is Marie-Claude Hemming, and I am Director of External Affairs at the Civil Engineering Contractors Association. For those of you who don't know who we are, SECA represents the bulk of those companies who build and maintain the UK's public infrastructure. Now, I'm sure you're all aware that the UK construction sector is an extremely strategic industry, accounting for 8.6% of GDP. That's not just infrastructure, that's looking at housing and other disciplines within the construction sector. And this is nearly 4 times the combined annual output of the aerospace and automotive industries. As it stands, and this was before lockdown, planned investment includes 700 projects and over 500 billion of investment in the national infrastructure pipeline. 118 billion is within the construction pipeline, and there's also a planned government spend of 7.2 billion in housing. So this is a substantial amount of money, which in turn will revitalise, will make the UK a better place to live and work. And this was what we had planned before COVID-19 and what we are aiming for after COVID-19. The last 2 years have been focused on Brexit negotiations, and as a result, political appetite, I mean, they were still very, very keen on infrastructure, but we never really felt things got going until the start of this year when we had a really positive budget. We look forward to a spending review, and then we had COVID. So, yeah, these things come in twos, don't they? But the will is still there, and history teaches us that the only way to drive us to get ourselves out of a recession or a depression is to invest in infrastructure, and in turn it makes people's lives better. We talk about levelling up. Never has the time been more apparent to level up, because we've learned that we don't all need to do our jobs in London, and actually we can do our jobs across the UK. So I think now is the prime time to really focus on levelling up. Like other parts of the economy, we are of course really impacted by COVID-19, and there have been catastrophic falls in output. This means that many firms are now feeling uncertain about the future. And we really welcomed what government have done. And the industry has responded to the crisis by creating a cross-industry task force with representation from the Construction Leadership Council, the Department for Business, the Infrastructure Projects Authority, the Infrastructure Clients Group, SECA, and other leading trade federations. Together, we have come together to develop a series of initiatives to provide immediate support to the sector and later on to look towards recovery. And the importance of us coming together and working as one within this crisis, the pandemic, cannot be understated. We have spoken with one voice, and to this end, there's been lots of studies have said that the construction workers are the most optimistic about work and employment in the future. So, and that's not even from anything we've put out, it's general survey collation. So I think that's really positive. But we're not out of the woods yet by any means. The industry-wide roadmap that the Construction Leadership Council put together aims to increase the which is focusing on recovery, aims to increase the activity across the construction ecosystem, accelerate the process of industry adjustment to the new normal, and build capacity in the industry to deliver strategic priorities. And these include increasing UK-wide prosperity, decarbonisation, modernisation through digital and manufacturing technologies, and delivering better, safe buildings. In essence, we're looking towards recovery and growth, and this is an opportunity to do what we have been talking about for years, to start doing things differently. There are 3 phases to the plan, which will be delivered over the next 2 years, because that is the crunch point: restart, reset, and reinvent. Altogether, these 3 phases will transform our sector, leading to improved outcomes for all, for the public purse, for the person who includes infrastructure in their daily lives, but which is everyone, but doesn't really think about it, for our member companies. And we've worked really well as one at the moment, and you know, that's something that we have done to a certain extent in the past, but this year has really brought us together. The failure to build on the plan and to act on the recommendations will miss an opportunity to deliver this transformational recovery, and risks our industry lapsing into a longer term recession, which, as we learned in 2008, erodes capability and skills and leaves a smaller, weaker sector as a legacy. We anticipate that the recovery from COVID-19 will be gradual, and lost output will require 2 years to recover, with most of the recovery taking place next year, so we just need to hang on till then. Supporting the recovery, as I said, requires one single industry plan to coordinate activity to reactivate the ecosystem, and this plan needs to be agile, initiated quickly, and then developed. The rollout of world-class infrastructure is, of course, a key part of this, and here at Sika we are leading on 8 key areas. The key thing to start with is visibility of future pipeline and unblocking blocked projects. So we have, for Sika members, and if you're not a Sika member, please do get in touch, put together a pipeline of future procurement opportunities in the UK at national and regional levels. This is something that gives our members confidence and helps us understand what schemes are rolling out on a UK-wide level. And we're looking at national level and we're looking at local level. So we would like to support this with webinars with some of our clients to talk about the challenges that we'll face, and also to give everyone confidence that we are ready to go. You know, we are ready to come out of these challenging times. One thing that I noticed, there's a lot of local government, what do you call the attendees on this webinar, and so we are keen to understand how we can support you in unlocking and unblocking projects. So if you would like to discuss this further, please do get in touch. Our second key area we're focusing on, of course, is working safely on site, and this is developing programs to support our members implementing COVID-19 prevention on sites, and other safety issues. The key thing comes, of course, which is an industry-wide challenge, is supporting and ensuring we don't move in towards a cash flow crisis, and this is something that has already been discussed in other people's presentations. In essence, we're looking to secure and measure prompt payments across the supply chain, and also focusing on the long-standing issue of retentions. Going hand in hand with that is also something which wasn't in the recovery plan, but something which is going to impact on our members and was a challenge to start with. You may have, well, you've probably forgotten now, but in the budget, the government announced that it was going to look towards moving the rebate for red diesel for construction firms within the 2-year period. while this may have been manageable before COVID-19, it's going to be a big challenge now because there is not enough, there is no, it needs to be factored into existing contracts, which will be a challenge. And secondly, there's not quite the technology there worldwide to make it affordable. So this is a big challenge, and we're hoping that the delay could be extended for more than 2 years. Then another key issue, which is going to start affecting our member companies now, is the issue of professional indemnity insurance and performance bonds. And this also goes hand in hand with the fact that a lot of companies are seeing potential increases in contractual disputes. Now, the Construction Leadership Council has worked with its members to produce a piece of industry guidance which basically builds on the good practice demonstrated within the public sector through the various PPNs, which basically says, play nicely, because if everyone starts lawyering up now, we are going to have a substantial problem within our supply chains in the next 8 to 10 months. And this piece of guidance has been endorsed by the government as well through a note they have put out. However, there are still challenges remain in the fact of increasing contractual disputes, which is something that SECA is very, very aware of. Alongside that, as I previously mentioned, issues surrounding availability of professional indemnity insurance and issues of bonds, and we are working across the industry to address these challenges. And then going hand in hand, there are obviously emerging employment issues which need to be addressed by companies as we start returning to work, and SECA is helping its members by providing tailored guidance on how to anticipate and address these challenges. And at the same time, we're really, the industry has struggled to retain skills in the past, and this it's a long and outstanding issue. And the key thing is now, how do we retain and develop the skills where a lot of people aren't able to go into college? So we'll be looking at, for our members, a programme of online training on SECA syllabus subjects. I've spoken about contractual disputes. I mean, that's the big thing that's coming up now, that and payment. And we're looking towards looking towards the future in terms of what does bidding and contractualisation look like. So I think I'm going to stop now. I've addressed the recovery plan and the SECA focused plan for its members and how we can support our members in coming out of this crisis. And I think I'll stop now and hand over to my next panellist.
Well, just be next panellist. Thanks very much for that, Marie-Claude. I've actually posted in the chat a link to an article on infrastructure intelligence that talks about the industry recovery plan. There's within it a link to the whole of the plan, which again I would urge everybody to read in the audience, because it does contain quite a lot of well, not just stuff, it really is what it says on the tin, and that is a roadmap for recovery for the sector. And we will be in subsequent infrastructure intelligence webinars covering most of these issues, both in terms of the issues in our June series and also in our July series as well. If I could just remind all of our speakers as well, as a housekeeping announcement, to mute when you're not speaking so we don't hear any background noise. And also just to the audience, if you do have any questions, keep posting them in the questions box. And if you do remember to put your organisation there, we'll mention your organisation as well when I ask the panelists the question. Our final panelist is Ben Marshall, who's a research director from Ipsos Mori, who are specialists, I suppose you would have to say, in the garnering and the assessment of public opinion. Ben wrote a really interesting article actually for Infrastructure Intelligence on public opinion and how that is actually changing as a result of the COVID crisis, and maybe what effect that might have on the kind of infrastructure and the infrastructure sector itself going forward. So I, for one, am fascinated to hear what Ben's got to say on this issue, because at the end of the day, one of the most important things for the industry, as well as influencing clients and influence government, we've got to take the public with us as well. So I'm really interested to hear what Ben Marshall from Ipsos Mori has got to say. Ben, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Andy. Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to talk today. As Andy's alluded to, I'm going to really talk about this issue through the lens of public opinion. Marie-Claude has already referred to the will still being there, but as Andy has just mentioned, the political will is obviously very much shaped by the public will. And I'm going to really echo many of the things that Ben and Saya have already said in terms of talking about attitudes to the economy, in terms of attitudes to decarbonisation, and the public's priority in respect of infrastructure. I'm a research director at Ipsos Mori. I lead our transport and infrastructure business. We help clients make policy, make decisions, tell a story about infrastructure covering rail, roads, housing, broadband, and other sectors. But as a company, our mission is to understand society, to understand the zeitgeist, if you like, reflected perhaps in the saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and we've seen that in infrastructure over many years. What's happened to fracking? Heathrow, would Heathrow have been built by now if the public had been behind it more? A misunderstanding about NIMBYism and the failure to address NIMBYism. So very important that we as a sector remain culturally relevant and customer focused. And that's not just me saying that. That's been a policy position for the National Infrastructure Commission for some years now. In fact, the first National Infrastructure Assessment used social research, a conversation with the public, to shape its direction of travel. The main point I'm going to make, in answer to your question that you set us all, Andy, yes, of course, infrastructure through the lens of public opinion has an absolutely crucial role to play in kickstarting the economy. The question really, as the other panelists have alluded to, is not whether, it's what role it has and how should it help to kickstart the economy. I am going to speculate a little bit, as Andy mentioned, as I did in my piece recently, but I'm not going to make predictions. I mean, who would make predictions right now? Infrastructure is a long game. I'm going to perhaps identify a couple of signals of potential changes in public opinion that might matter. And I'm also going to draw on data collected before COVID, the outbreak. We are at a moment of change. I'm not going to talk about 15-minute cities or the end of mass transit as we know it. That's not something I'm going to do. In some ways, though, I think our theory of change is that this crisis is likely to intensify trends that were already there, both in terms of public opinion and values, and also, of course, in terms of delivery. I think we're expecting quite as one of my clients puts it, a fierce competition at the next spending review. And infrastructure, what I'm going to talk about is the ways perhaps infrastructure can compete in that fiercely competitive environment. Let me say a few things about attitudes towards the economy. Clearly, a big part of the culture I mentioned earlier is public attitudes towards the economy. And after the 2008 financial crisis, the public really did get, if not fully supportive of it, certainly grudgingly accepting of austerity and the idea that we should be reining back investment. And that meant that they tended to see public spending plans through a prism of, can we afford this? Why this? Why now? Who benefits and who doesn't? In March this year, we recorded economic optimism at the lowest it has been since 2008. Nearly half think the economy will have changed a great deal in 12 months' time. 3 in 10 that it would take 2 years or longer for us to see growth again. So there's a lot of pessimism out there. 57% don't think that most of the jobs lost during the pandemic will return. So people feel that this is really a moment of change. Despite those concerns, it was interesting in some of the conversations about jobs versus climate change. At the moment, the issue is really jobs versus health. It's about lives against livelihoods, and the British public have been for quite some time very hesitant, very cautious about kickstarting the economy, returning the economy, opening the economy up. We did a survey across 14 countries at the end of April. The British were the most cautious of all of those nations in terms of easing lockdown. The majority view now is that lockdown was eased too soon, and many are anxious about that change. We asked people whether the government should prioritise people's health over economic health in March, and they chose public health by a margin of 5 to 1. We repeated that 2 weeks ago. It was almost identical. And of course, we are in a stage of suspended reality. Furlough is protecting our workforce in ways that perhaps the American economy is not experiencing. And I'm going to talk a lot, obviously, about the UK situation, not internationally. But that will come to an end. And what we should be more encouraged about, perhaps, is there has been a shift over several years now towards favouring higher spending and, in principle, higher taxes. The British public are supportive of tax rises, probably tax rises that they themselves are not experiencing, but still, hypothecated taxes for the NHS, popular. Green taxes, scope for those. Taxing the wealthy in our society, that's popular. Bringing utilities and the railways back into state ownership, which of course has happened during this pandemic, also popular. So anyway, clearly there is an imperative to kickstart the economy, and there is no going back to austerity. In the infrastructure revolution, if the revolution was about spending, that has the backing of the British public. So let me move on a little bit to the fundamentals of what the British public think about infrastructure. It won't surprise you to learn that both the term infrastructure is a little bit off-putting to people. It doesn't mean an awful lot, but also that people don't walk around thinking about this issue and this term an awful lot. But they do see infrastructure as absolutely pivotal to economic progress. 80% think that investing in infrastructure is vital to the country's future economic growth. 6 in 10 do not think we're doing enough to meet our infrastructure needs. So infrastructure is pushing at an open door. It is a great opportunity to state its case. And we found something of an emotional attachment to the idea of Britain getting on its feet again, building again. We don't build anything anymore, say people in focus groups. Remember George Osborne's We Are the Builders. That has the idea of keeping up with the Joneses and just really getting back to some sort of normality after this crisis would be quite appealing. But infrastructure has something of an image problem. When we asked the public across 29 countries last year to rate infrastructure in their country, defined as, we defined infrastructure, we didn't just leave it hanging, we got substantially lower levels of satisfaction than we did when we asked about individual sectors or types of infrastructure. And the implication of this is that while the infrastructure story, the big picture needs telling, the term can be off-putting. So we need to build relevance. We need to talk about projects and sectors. Another thing that some people the panelists have mentioned already is there is something of a democratic deficit and a need to level up. 55% globally believe that not enough is done to involve people in decision making about infrastructure, and only 8% disagree. And slightly more disagree than agree in Britain that their local area gets its fair share of infrastructure. But it's 56% in the north and 26% in London. So in terms of getting fair share, so Londoners are much more likely to disagree that they don't get their fair share than those in the north of the country. In fact, we ranked 22nd out of 29 countries, hence the popularity of levelling up. The other thing is we don't have a record of getting it done. So 48% in 2016 agreed that Britain has a poor record at getting infrastructure projects right. Last year, that was 53%. So after Crossrail, think of the narrative about HS2. If we're to invest big, we need to invest in efforts to improve confidence that we will deliver. So there's a democratic deficit and also a delivery deficit. And that the problem for infrastructure is many of the the benefits are quite intangible, and it means that projects are often judged on cost and budget. You know, and we all know how difficult it is. McKinsey did a study suggesting that over 90%, I think it is, of mega projects are over budget. So it's almost systemic. Other thing to say more encouragingly, that people are pretty pragmatic in terms of foreign investment and particularly private investment. You know, that's something that will be important, particularly as we're seeing perhaps a hunkering down, trade wars, more nativist, parochial approaches to the economy and the fragmenting of globalization, as Mark Carney put it. The other thing to say about the British is that they do kind of make do and mendish is in Outlook, is that they do favour maintenance of current assets over investing in the new. So we're not perhaps as enamoured with the Le Grand Projet as perhaps the French and other nations. So what of COVID? Well, we don't know what this is going to look like in a year's time, perhaps not even 2 weeks' time, but there are a few signals, perhaps, a sort of paradigm shifting that might influence infrastructure's ability to get its valuable work done. The first thing is that whilst I think it's unlikely that the public will return to an austerity sentiment, sensitivities about budgets might become a little bit more acute. And the other thing to say is that infrastructure has historically, I think, talked very much in terms of GDP and you know, sort of almost Keynesian accelerative impacts. The public don't see GDP as being an indicator of a strong economy to half the extent that they see jobs. Job creation is really, really important. So talking about infrastructure and the difference it makes to jobs, particularly after we come out of furlough and we will see the real shape of the economy and unemployment, that's going to be important. The other thing I mentioned in my article is that we might start to see a shift towards social infrastructure. For the Institute of Civil Engineers last year, we did a survey on housing and infrastructure, and essentially support for new build housing swung from 54% to 60% if people were told that the right infrastructure would be in place alongside that housing. And when we ask people which of these types of infrastructure should people invest in, all economic infrastructure, 9% almost had the wherewithal to say, I don't think any of those are priorities. Actually, what is a priority is more GP surgeries and better schools. So given the NHS, the sensitivity about the future of the NHS and the hospital building programme and just kit and PPE, that might be a bit of a challenge. I think for infrastructure, what we need to do is say, this is not a zero-sum game. Actually, you need the both together. We need homes fit for heroes. We need infrastructure fit for heroes. We need to get people to hospitals and schools, etc. So I think that's something we can do, is better make the links between economic infrastructure and social infrastructure. And then the other thing, just in terms of, I think, a more local focus, it was interesting that Sophie Ellis-Bextor said about her school disco initiative, that she said that the world feels like it ends at these four walls, and we might become a little bit more parochial and local. We are noticing perhaps the potholes even more as we walk past them, if not drive over them. And obviously the government has accelerated investment in street infrastructure, if you like, but also infrastructure that improves well-being. There is a long tail to this crisis about our mental health and how we are coping with isolation, etc. So things that help us well-being wise will be important. And I think digital is the clear winner from the pandemic so far, in a way, if that's the right phrase. 6 in 10 now agree that because of technology, I expect people to be traveling less in the future. We've experienced digital hyperactivity. 36% expect to be spending more time online in 12 months compared to pre-crisis. Superfast broadband has not been a public priority in the past. It has been for captains of industry, but we might see a change in that. We want to watch that quite closely. It's always been mid-table, but maybe it will shoot up. But then there isn't quite the same sense that digital will fall over. This is one of the problems with energy, is that people don't think the lights will go out, whereas they can see the problems with rail and flood defences. Just coming to an end, decarbonisation. Last year was the year we saw the green environmental agenda really cut through with the public. We've asked people for a few years now, which of these 8 factors should be important in decision making about infrastructure, and the environment doubled in salience. It's now the top issue as a decision making priority for the public. They are, though, divided about exactly what needs to happen in terms of prioritizing environment over economy. You know, there is a difference between wanting the world to be better and changing your own individual behaviour. But last year, the British public prioritised investment in solar over 13 other sectors. Wind energy made the top 5, and of course, recently we've seen planning permission granted for the largest solar farm in England. And then finally, I think the car is important. The car was described as the mainstay by Grant Shapps at a briefing recently, I think there does need to be a reset, but for some short term at least, the car does seem to be, and roads does seem to be the focus of attention, particularly as we all holiday in this country this year, etc. So in summary, and through the lens of public opinion, you know, if we are to see the infrastructure revolution, it's not just increasing spending. It's about a step change, as the other panelists have said, in being smart, being prudent, being green. I think infrastructure needs to keep making its case compellingly and consistently, and it can play a key role in kickstarting the economy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ben. Some fascinating statistics there, some of which maybe don't make the best reading for the industry, you know, particularly where there is still some doubt from the public over the benefits of infrastructure investment. But nevertheless, I think we have to take them on board, because that's what people are thinking, and obviously that can, you know, can affect how they view things going forward. And I just want to kick the questions off on that particular issue. How does the industry get to change its reputation, get to change that public perception about investment in construction and infrastructure being a real boon to the economy and to society? And I'll kick off with Saya first on that one. What's your view on?
Thanks for starting me on a really, really hard question. Look, I think there's something about there's something about the narrative of what infrastructure is, and I think there is something about perception as well. So I think a narrative is very much around some of the things that Ben spoke about, is broadening the understanding. So Ben Marshall, we have 2 Bens. So is broadening the understanding of infrastructure beyond just some of the economic aspects, but also understanding social infrastructure. So I think there's a critical narrative there, and then as well as the role that it plays in actually in helping us deal with the climate crisis. I think when you look at the generational shift that we have as well today, there is a huge emphasis on climate as the most important thing. You know, I think for millennials, like, technology was the thing that shaped their lives. When you look at the generation now coming after millennials, I think that's Gen Z. I always forget which is which, but for them, climate is the definition of their generation, right? So when we talk about infrastructure, I think we need to talk about a narrative around how it brings societies together, communities together, but also how it solves the emergency crisis. So the climate crisis. I think the second thing is about perception, and I spoke to this earlier. This has to be an industry that is attractive for lots of people. You know, if we're really honest, most school leavers are not saying, I really want to go into construction, or I really want to go into infrastructure, right? So this has to change. And for me, the connection to the narrative will bring about attracting a different sort of a broader and more diverse set of people who want to be part of this. If we move away from, you know, I spend a lot of my time in road and rail, it's very important, but if we move away just from road and rail and we move much more towards decarbonisation, we move much more towards environmental change, we move much more towards societal change and social infrastructure, I think that will help us with the perception gap as well that infrastructure has, and bring and make it a really, really attractive place for a lot of people to want to make their careers.
You spoke about social value when you addressed us earlier on. Is there something in that from the point of view of changing public perceptions, I wonder?
Thanks, Andy. I do think there is. I think a lot of people's impression of infrastructure is done to them by clever people who spend our money. I think there's a real detachment between, when you say infrastructure, certainly from my world, when you say infrastructure, I think road, rail, maybe 5G. I don't necessarily think my house, my street, my school, and I think a greater attachment in terms of learning and teaching and engaging people on what you can do with the money you invest in infrastructure. We have to tell people these stories. It's a narrative. We just come off a week doing work experience. We had about, we think a couple of thousand 14-year-olds take part 2 years ago. Digital is amazing. But one of the things that came out of it was, in that digital week, we had half girls taking part. Normally work experience reaches about 15% girls. If we want to talk to the kids, we want to deal with sustainability. We need to get them excited about infrastructure, because that's how they're going to solve these problems. The people we need to recruit into our industry are the kids on strike in the climate strikes, because they're the ones who care. My generation worried about the harm we were doing to the environment. This generation want to fix it. They want to change it. They want to make a difference, and they want to do it. Whereas I think our generation were nervous about it and NIMBYist about it. So we have to tell stories, and social value is part of that. It's about showing people what you can do when you invest money. But I think storytelling is a big part of that, and just continuing to explain to people how much of a difference you make on people's lives when you do that right. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Ben. Ben Lewis, do you think the confidence in the delivery of infrastructure maybe is poor because it isn't strategically planned with, let's say, land use planning, so people don't necessarily see the benefits of the expenditure that's made? Do you have a view on that? If you can just unmute yourself, Ben, we're just not getting you there. Ben, we're not hearing you, Ben. Can you just unmute? Just while Ben sorts himself out, is Ben back with us, Ben Lewis? No, he's not. He's not. I can't hear him. I don't know whether anyone else can. No, we can't hear Ben at the moment. It's the green icon, Ben, that you need to press. I'll move on to another question, if I may. There's been a number of questions posed in the chat around, and someone mentioned it as well in their contribution, around some of the legal challenges that have been made in relation to infrastructure projects. And there's obviously a correlation there between, green investment. Do the panel think that we could have some issues there with some of these mega projects that might be seen to be unenvironmentally friendly? And also flowing from that, this whole conversation around green infrastructure, what do people think of the potential barriers to investment in green infrastructure going forward? I don't know whether Ben is back with us, if he can address any of that.
Can you hear me now, Andy?
Yeah, perfectly.
I think I was muted externally rather than by myself, so somebody didn't want me to speak. I think there is a point, and it ties in a bit with what Sire and Chris are saying as well, about the public's understanding of infrastructure. I mean, I think of as an example, just my LinkedIn profile has me as an infrastructure director. I'm constantly bombarded with people trying to sell me cloud software solutions. So it means different things to different people. And I think for the public, it's whether, I mean, Ben Marshall may have a view on this, whether there's a perception of infrastructure as just large-scale road and rail building and nuclear power stations, which people see as mega projects with mega impacts, and whether we need to work on the understanding that those projects, by definition and by the effects they can have on other aspects of society, will actually deliver reductions in air pollution, address the climate change barrier, which in turn lead to health improvements and societal improvements. and whether that message is getting lost. And I think that's something that can be worked on. But I think you mentioned the challenges to delivery. I think at the moment, were you specifically referring to legal challenges, Andy, or more in terms of
some of those legal challenges? Yeah, where people are actually making challenges. Some of them obviously politically motivated as well in relation to large scale roads projects. We've seen it potentially with Heathrow, HS2, etc.
I think it is eroding confidence, and I think, as I said in my preamble, the DCO regime has been there from a consenting perspective and it's delivered certainty. And we've recently at Barton Wilmore completed a report on the last sort of 10-12 years of the regime, and the resounding opinions from people who use it is that it does give the certainty you need, and it is something that can be relied on, particularly from a timescale perspective. But we are finding now that increasingly, with the delays to the government decisions and the increasing number of challenges, there's a risk that certainty and confidence will be eroded.
Okay, thanks, Ben. I've got another question, this one for Marie-Claude. There's been some talk about how quickly decisions are made in relation to infrastructure, and also, whether or not they're necessarily projects done in a quick enough sort of time scale. How do we actually speed that up, and how do we get the government to make those necessary decisions in a quicker way? If you can just unmute yourself, Marie-Claude.
Sorry. In the last few years, the government has had its mind on other matters, and to this extent, there have been things have naturally slowed down. I mean, in terms of making the transition from the announcement of the project to delivery, we can look at a variety of things. And Ben's talked about issues surrounding planning and project and scheme development in terms of generating the quickest process via the planning system, via legal challenges. And this is something the government are looking at, enabling everyone to keep having their say, of course, but to choose the right model for the right projects. But also it looks towards something that Chris might be interested in terms of reforming the procurement system process to make it speedier. SEEK has done a huge amount of work on looking at the challenges in procurement and how we could streamline it to make it effective and less costly and less burdensome for our members and in turn the public purse. So there's lots of things that we can do to streamline infrastructure projects, and also we have to look at the funding cycles. In terms of highways, in Highways England, they have made a substantial improvements because they now work towards a 5-year project cycle. You have your plan, Roads Investment Strategy 1, Roads Investment Strategy 2, you know what's coming. Yes, sometimes projects move into the next one, but you generally have an idea of where things are going. So it's small steps, and you have to look from the very start right to the very end. And we as an industry have to look on ourselves as well into addressing the issues in the supply chain, addressing how we procure between each our companies, how our client procures with us, and then how the client responds to the government's announcement and the process from the ministerial announcement right down to the very end.
Thanks, Marie-Claude. Just bring Chris back in on that. How practically though can we pressurize clients to speed up that procurement process? Obviously, you've got to go through due process where necessary, but how can we actually get that speeded? And I'm particularly thinking about maybe the whole digital side of things that Ben Marshall mentioned in relation to what's been happening in the recent period, whether the increasing use of digital's got a role to play in that as well.
It does 100%. I mentioned already that framework procurement is a part of that, at least in terms of an interim solution, because it's a very quick way to appoint your contractors. And we have lots of frameworks in this country that are already in place. We need to stop inventing new frameworks. Lots of clients doing their own procurement. Just get on with what we've got. There's plenty of people out there ready to deliver projects. That bit we talked about. I think that the digital side, there's an awful lot of British cycling incremental gains to be had to get a gold medal. I think a really good example of that is electronic signatures and e-contracts. So we work with a lot of local authorities who still insist on signing their contracts under seal. So you do BIM you do efficient. All the supply chain parties might be using a project bank account, I don't know. But the bottom line is everything's digital except the client who prints the contract out and signs it. They even do that once a week by statute. We've got to hack that system, and we have methods to do it. We just need to talk to the people with the legacy systems and processes to get rid of some of those things. So there's a lean thing, and the industry needs to get real about the collaborative lean, not just individual lean. Client, contractor, procurement, supply chain. We need to have much more transparency and honesty with each other to do that. I think the other thing is early contractor involvement, whether that's by clause or informally. There is a huge need to involve the person that's going to do your infrastructure construction in agreeing what the budget's going to be. And for me, you look at the slowdown of HS2 to secure funding, you look at pretty much every project that ever hits the press, it's the same symptoms manifesting. For me, same root cause. Involve the people who know what it's going to cost at source at the start, not the middle of your project, and you might get a different result. As it is, when you do decide to involve them, you've then got to go through repricing. So I've got real concerns that and particularly I think the construction of buildings hasn't learned from the construction of civil engineering projects. The civil engineering world is massively more collaborative than the rest of the built environment. We've got to get ahead of that, because it's a major barrier both to effective delivery of local projects, but also it's a governance barrier that perhaps doesn't need to be there. When you talk about reform of the planning system, ensuring the public are consulted on projects, that's all really important stuff. And some of those barriers are necessary. They're right for a civil society. But to introduce artificial barriers purely because you have a legacy way of doing something or an old-fashioned form of contract is really dangerous and something that we've got to get rid of in the short term, not the long term, the short term. So there's kind of a lean debate to be had about how we make decisions on projects. But as I say, early contractor involvement, huge deal in that space to get the price right earlier.
Just still on the use of digital, there's obviously quite a lot of virtual consultation and engagement going on at the moment by necessity, because obviously people can't meet. Nick Cooper asks, is there a risk that any statutory consultations going forward could be legally challenged or deemed insufficient? Has the legislation and the reg been amended to ensure that new methods are objection proof? Ben Lewis from Barton Wilmore, what's your view on that? And if you can unmute yourself, please, Ben.
Apologies, should have learned from the last time. I'm not a lawyer, I'm a planner, but so I wouldn't like to comment too much on a legal challenge position. But my view is, I mean, the legislation was brought in place to allow the consultation to take place digitally. A lot of the consultations that are currently ongoing are what they class as non-statutory consultation rather than statutory. So with the crisis lifted, there may be an opportunity for the more traditional types of consultation to come back in. But I think from a legal challenge perspective, I mean, you have to ask yourself, if it was in front of a judge, how would they rule in terms of it's a legitimate and it's an appropriate way to consult? You try to reach as many people as you possibly could through the process. I have no doubt that we will see challenges coming forward, though, on this basis. And it'll be a case of, as was always the case with these, is the first one will go through will set the precedent for the others.
Okay, thanks for that. We'll have to finish quite shortly, but I've got a question that I want to address to everybody, and that's, the title of this webinar was about kickstarting the economy, and obviously part of the economy is money and finance. And clearly we've seen in the recent period the government spending fortunes in relation to supporting industry, supporting businesses, supporting workers. Obviously in relation to infrastructure, before COVID happened, the government talked about an infrastructure revolution, and they were obviously prepared to put money into that. In any infrastructure development going forward. What do the panel think briefly about how we can actually encourage that with infrastructure as we move out of COVID, and how can we improve certainty and confidence so that that money actually does come to the table? And if I can start with Saya on that one.
Sure. Look, I actually don't think we will have a huge amount of problem encouraging money. I think there's a lot of private capital around, and I think governments around the world are showing desire to also invest public capital. I think if there's something that we can learn from the 2008-2009 sort of financial crisis, though, is that there was a lot of cheap money that sort of flooded the industry and therefore in some senses eroded benefits. I think what we have to avoid is that we're investing in new projects, not in investing existing planned programs. And for me, I think, just if I can also link it a bit to that for me also links to the green investment point that we've talked about to an extent. You know, there's so much now positivity around investing in green, and we've seen sort of talks about how ESG funds are outperforming other funds and so on. These are also relatively small, and I think we've also got to be really pragmatic about understanding how much of our economy is structurally still dependent on fossil fuels, and there will be. When I say my economy, I mean like our pension plans, right, are dependent on dividends from fossil fuel companies. So I think the barriers and the challenge are much more about really getting to those deep structural changes than it is about access to capital, and then as well around what I think we've touched on to an extent, which is about understanding short-term projects that address economic improvement and sort of multiplier effect in terms of jobs now, balanced with long-term structural changes, because the change is needed now, not in 3, 5, 10 years time.
Thanks, Saya. Ben Marshall, have you got any insights on that in terms of who pays for it all?
Well, huge question. I mean, I don't think people have realised just how yet, because we're yet to see the way the economy settles, just how deep those tax cuts might go, and then with how much of the population they reach, etc. There's lots of big political issues to work through. But just to say, I mean, I think clean growth, I mean, this is what it is. I think the public are at a position where, yes, we'll need to grow the economy. Infrastructure is a big part of that, but they don't want it at any cost. It needs to be clean. I think politicians look at investments in terms of, is it necessary, is it popular, and infrastructure clean growth does fit those criteria. For infrastructure sector, I mean, we've touched on some issues that are big systemic issues. Should the Major Projects Authority play a greater role in supervision and governance? Should we have what the French have with a dialogue with the public about infrastructure projects early on in the process? But really, it is about building tangibility, and what's more tangible than saving the planet? What's more tangible than job creation? And then the important thing is the difference this makes, as Saya was saying, to people's localities and lives.
Thanks for that, Ben. The other Ben now, Ben Lewis, your views on that. How do we make sure that money comes in? Saya said that she didn't think it would be a massive issue, it would be there, but how do we make sure that it does come in a timely fashion?
I mean, I think, I agree with both the things that Ben and Saya have said, but if the money's out there, the government needs to make sure that, from my perspective anyway, that the planning and strategy is there to support that. And particularly with new technologies coming forward, the government has thought through incentives. I mentioned pump storage earlier. It's a technology we desperately need as part of an energy transition, but there's no route to market currently because of the incentive structure. I think the national infrastructure strategy will make a difference, honestly. And it would sort of provide a holistic picture about everything, which will give the confidence there. And we need to get through the NPS challenges that are going on at the moment, find a way to settle that down, get back to business as usual in terms of timescales on consenting, but just reinforce the positivity in the planning regime. But also, as Chris mentioned earlier, early contractor involvement. I mean, we've seen Highways England take on this model in the last couple of years. It is becoming more and more critical for these large-scale infrastructure projects to be delivered post-planning on time and to budget.
Thanks for that, Ben. Marie-Claude, your view on that, and how does the recovery plan, fit into all of that? How do we encourage that investment to come through?
I mean, I think that the investment will come through. I think we need to be we have, obviously the government has spent a huge amount of money in managing the impact of the pandemic, and we should look at that as a type of wartime investment. This, whilst the Treasury are keen, well, you know, they do say this must be paid back. If we look at the payments for the significant events, notably the last 2 world wars, that was a 50-year or so payment. You know, we shouldn't be frightened of spending money. This was a one-off global event, and it's affected everybody. So I would imagine that the timescales for payback will be far, far in the future, which puts a burden on the next generations, but on the other hand, it will enable catch up. On the other hand, I also think that it's important that we don't just stop spending, because I think that will do more harm than good. We have to rebuild our economy. We have to get back to a new normal. We have to enable to provide a world-class infrastructure for our generation, for our future generations. And when we do leave the European Union, we have to look global, economically advantageous across the world. So I think there is an issue of funding, but as Saya said, I don't think it's insurmountable. And I know that in the Treasury before the pandemic were looking at how we look at infrastructure finance. That consultation response hasn't been published. So I think it's a time now of opportunity. Let's not do what we've done in previous times, is hold back on the spending and go towards austerity, because in that actually does more damage than good. There are, of course, ways of managing projects better and doing things more efficiently, which we've all spoken about, and which the recovery plan seeks to address, namely by doing things like we've talked about, improving the way we work digitally, looking at what the future looks like, focusing on driving efficiency. So these things all go hand in hand, but I think it's really important that we keep going rather than batten down the hatches.
Chris Clark, fine perspective.
Yeah.
You know, obviously you work with the public and the private sector. You know, your perspectives on you know, that funding issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be a crisis of confidence in local government around spending, because so many of the local government organisations have overspent what they've been allocated in a very short time. I think we've got 3 or 4 local authorities effectively bankrupt at the moment. They're not really bankrupt because no one's going to let them go bust, but they are in negative equity to all intents and purposes because they've just spent so much money in the last few months. And that really kind of needs to be detached from infrastructure investment. The balance sheet, if you like, the revenue balance sheet in councils compared to the investment in infrastructure need to be 2 conversations. And to be fair to local authorities, they've always done a good job of keeping capital and revenue in balance. So I think that there's a need for government insistence, top-down insistence, that the investment in programs that was expected continues as far as it possibly can. One of the things we've got to think about is where the money comes from, and there are the mega projects which require one switch to be thrown. There's the mega program that is the public sector purse in local government, which needs 900, 1,000 switches to be thrown to keep it on. And government needs to be saying with real confidence to the public sector in local government, please keep spending, we want you to keep spending. People like us in industry will help that happen. I think the final thing is that from an industry perspective, the challenge from local government rightly will be, that's fine, but please show us you're doing this properly. Please prove that you're doing this well. Please do it transparently. So I think we have to be really careful we don't stop, because there won't be any industry to recover with if we're not careful. That's a really important point. Is any lag here will lose businesses. There's no question about that at all. But then in asking the public purse to be proactive and to keep the pump pumping, industry has got to be accountable, transparent, make its money more visibly, more openly. It'll be allowed to make more profit in a fairer way, which infrastructure business needs, if it's transparent about how it's spending it. So I would say quit the cloak and dagger on risk, show the risks you're delivering, show the client you're doing a good job, and get involved early and we'll be all right. Again, come back to collaboration. Openness, transparency, collaboration will see us through, because the industry's got the talent to make it happen, albeit the risks we've got on labour supply and industry sort of expertise supply, at least in the next 18 months. That's my view.
Thanks, Chris, very much for that, and thanks very much to all of my panel this morning and now obviously into this afternoon. Just before we log off, it's clear that the fact that everyone is dialing into this webinar from their homes, I believe, that the COVID crisis is going to be with us for a bit longer yet. And one of the key issues around that is making our industry resilient. And that is the next subject of our infrastructure intelligence webinar series. And that's taking place next Friday, same time, same place at 11 a.m. So if you haven't already registered for that, then please do so. And also have a look at the event section of our website, because you'll see all the other webinars that are on there. We're looking at business models going forward, and also how we communicate in the new normal environment that we're actually in. But just to wrap things up by saying a massive thank you to all of the panel this morning, to Marie-Claude Hemming from Seeker, from Saya Gambari from EY, from Ben Lewis from Barton Wilmore, from Ben Marshall from Ipsos Mori, and also, last but not least, to Chris Clark from Scape Group. And thanks to everybody for logging in, and we hope to see you next week to talk about infrastructure and industry resilience. So thanks very much indeed. Have a great Friday and have a great weekend. Thank you very much.